Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight. And those of you who couldn't attend, thank you for listening to this recording. This is the key. This is the go-to session on plot, and I am your instructor, professor, whatever, Dr. Joshua Begley. Some of you know me, some of you don't. For those of you who do know me, hi, nice to see you again. So, we are going to talk about plot, and I have to admit that there is a little bit of irony to me teaching this because plot is one of my weaker areas. I am very good, at least as far as I can tell anyway, with setting and character. Sometimes, though, it takes me a while to kind of figure out what the heck I'm doing. And so, in some ways, this also makes me the best person to teach this because it's really something that I have to think about. And so at the end of this, I'm going to walk you through my own process, which, spoiler, it's kind of messy. But to begin with, it's really important to define our terms because one thing that we don't want to do is confuse plot with story. And sorry, I'm going to mute everybody if I can. There we go. Everybody's muted. I'll unmute you. If you have something you'd like to say, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you. But please save the questions for after the presentation. So forgive me, I got off script there. What I was saying is that it's very important that we don't confuse plot with story. The two are actually different. They're related, but they're different. Wendy Bishop, in her textbook, Working Words, The Process of Creative Writing, says, a plot is a plan for a narrative, and the story puts that plan into action. What comes next is the essence of plot. Why is the essence of story? So the story is the meaning of it. The plot is really a series of events, scenes that are leading into one another organically, driven by character motivation and desire. But it's the story that gives it an actual thematic cohesion. Story is what gives it meaning, because without actual story, plot is just sound and fury signifying nothing, to take away from Shakespeare. To go a little further into this, the author Ross MacDonald, who wrote, among other things, the excellent Lou Archer detective series, wrote in a letter to Bill Ruhlman, plot is the syntax of narrative. The plot, at least in the kind of heavily armatured stories that I write, carries the meaning and controls it. I say this in order to lead your mind away from the notion that plot is merely a technical problem or a simplistic kind of skeleton on which you hang the living flesh of the narrative. Plot is the thing itself. Story as it reveals itself in the struggles of the mind with its own creation. So we must always remember that plot and story work together, but they are two different things. A story without a plot is formless. It wanders and meanders and may have something to say, but says it in such an unfocused, scattershot way that the message may be lost, or at the very least, it might not be presented in a way that's appealing and entertaining. Plot without story, on the other hand, is all structure and no purpose. This simile that I'm going to use might not mean much to you if you don't live in Orlando, but it's like the I-4 eyesore. And, it exists, it takes up space, it has a distinct shape and form, but it says nothing. It does nothing. It just exists. So plot and story have to work together. So, oops, I jumped ahead on the thing. So we've covered what is plot. Now let's move on to the difference between plotters and pantsers. So again, we need to start by defining our terms. Plotters plan everything out to varying degrees. The amount of planning that you go into as a plotter is really going to vary depending upon who you are and your own point of view and your own comfort level. Pantsers, on the other hand, begin with a vague idea and then let the story take them where it will. So there is a third group that's kind of in between called the plantser. I think this is a fairly new term because I've not really encountered it much before I started putting this together. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But really, we're just going to concentrate on the two main groups, plotters and pantsers. And it might be better to think of them less as hard and distinct terms and more of a sliding scale. You fall closer to one or the other, but it's not an either or sort of situation. So I won't tell you which one I am, but I'll let you guess before we move on. So we're going to start with plotters here. So plotters, shockingly enough, plot out their story to varying degrees before starting a book. Some begin with a general outline, some diagram scenes they're going to work on that day, and some plot out every scene in the book before they write the first word in chapter 1. Other plotters have long book Bibles with backgrounds on every character, details on the town their story is set in, etc., etc. This is the story Bible. You are actually asked to do this in developing new worlds. That's a form of plotting. Now, one thing that I'm going to focus on, one element, technique, that's the word I'm looking for here, that I'd like to focus on a little bit is the story, using a storyboard, because I think many of you in the program and many of you who go to Full Sail, who may not even be in the creative writing program, are pretty visual people. And so using a storyboard can really help you visualize the plot and might work better than, say, a bullet note, list of scenes and everything else. So the magic of a storyboard is turning a book idea into a visual tool. This makes the story structure easier to grasp and handle for those who are visually oriented. A storyboard can be drawn on a board, a piece of paper, or you can make it in a computer file. It's completely up to you. It's completely whatever you're comfortable with. You mark it with vertical and horizontal lines until you can make a checkerboard pattern, and each resulting square represents one chapter of your book. So if you plan on writing 20 chapters, for example, you'll want 20 squares. And so in those squares, you'll write the scenes, chapters, the characters who are in there. One thing that I advise to always have in those squares is character motivation, a goal and motivation. What does your protagonist want? Why do they want it? And then, of course, what stands in their way. And so this can be a great tool if you're visually oriented and so inclined to do that. If you're less visual, on the other hand, you can do the list. Sometimes simple is better. KISS, keep it simple, student. The list is, of course, going to be less visual, but it does give a sense of forward progression. You can see how one scene leads into the other, almost running downhill until it reaches its inevitable conclusion. One thing that I will say, regardless if you're a plotter, pantser, or plantser, is you have to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of the and then problem. If you are mapping out your story and you find that the way you're describing it is this happens and then that happens and then that happens and so on and so forth, you don't really have a story. You just have a series of events that are artificially put together. What you want is a sense of causation going through there. This happened, and because of that, this happened in response. And now this happened, but this happen, and now the protagonist has to do this in response to that. So everything links together. It's a chain of causality. Action leads to reaction, which leads to more action and more reaction, and so on and so forth, until you reach the climax, which is the moment of absolute action. So I'm going to tell you some famous plotters and what they have to say about why they write this way. So John Grisham, the writer of legal thrillers, says, I don't start a novel until I have lived with the story for a while to the point of actually writing an outline. And after a number of books, I've learned that the more time I spend on the outline, the easier the book is to write. And if I cheat on the outline, I get in trouble with the book. R.L. Stine, who many of you probably grew up with, says, if you do enough planning before you start to write, there's no way you can have writer's block. I do a complete chapter by chapter outline. And then J.K. Rowling, who even if you haven't read her, read Harry Potter, you know the name, says, I always have a basic plot outline, but I like to leave some things to be decided while I write. So Rowling almost falls into the plantser category, which for those of you who are plantsers should make you feel pretty good. You're in good company there. So let's talk about the pros and cons of plotting for a minute. So the big pros, the big asset to doing this before you write is that you know what's going to happen before you write it. It's also easier to deal with writer's block. If you know what's going to happen next, it's going to be very hard to actually get stuck. And so you just move to the next part. Plotters, and this goes back to what John Grisham was saying, also tend to write their novels faster and more smoothly. So those are all pretty compelling reasons to plot your story. Now the cons. The big con has to do with how confining it could be. Once you have this plan, especially if it's kind of intricate, if you get stuck or you want to change something, you're going to have to redo so much. The general structure of the outline is so meticulous and refined that if in the actual writing of it you find, oh wow, this scene just does not work anymore, or this character is going off in a way that I don't expect, you're going to have to go back and think about, okay, what has come before this? How do I need to change this to make this this deviation fit? And then what do I have to do to make it work with the climax? And does the climax change? And so this can make for a lot of extra work for you. So that's plotters. Let's talk about pantsers. Now, pantsers, as you might imagine, fly by the seat of their pants when they write a story. They start off with no more than a kernel of an idea or a first sentence or character, and away they go. So, pantsers, there's not a lot to talk about, not quite like plotters, because there's a lot of different ways that one can go about plotting, and some really cool techniques that are out there. Like storyboarding and listing and things like that. Pantsers is just, you're sitting down and you're kind of letting the story take you where it goes. This can be exhilarating, but this can also be frightening. So some famous pantsers. First of all, we have Margaret Atwood, who of course is probably most famous for The Handmaid's Tale. Atwood says, when I'm writing a novel, what comes first is an image, scene, or voice. Something fairly small. Sometimes that seed is contained in a poem I've already written. The structure or design gets worked out in the course of the writing. I couldn't write the other way around, with structure first. It would be too much like paint by numbers. So, Pierce Brown, who writes thrillers, says, some writers are plotters. I, on the other hand, have the curse and rabid delight of being a pantser. I sit down at my computer every day praying for a lightning strike. Common symptoms include pacing, an abnormally clean house, frantic cups of joe, and middle of the night writing breakdowns. It doesn't make it sound very appealing, in my opinion. And one of the biggest pantsers of them all is my boy Stephen King. King says, plot is, I think, the good writer's last resort and the dullard's first choice. The story which results from it is apt to feel artificial and laboring. He goes on to say, in plotting, the situation comes first. The character, always flat and unfeatured to begin with, comes next. King is very clearly anti-plotting. It's not just that he prefers pantsing over plotting. It's that he actively dislikes plotting. He even has something else he said when he's in his book on writing. He talks about the difference between plot and story. He says, please remember, however, that there is a huge difference between story and plot. Story is honorable and trustworthy. Plot is shifty and best kept under house arrest. So those are his words, not mine. Don't kill the messenger. I do find it very interesting, though, that he feels very strongly about this. So pros and cons of pantsing. The pro is pretty obvious. You have the freedom to take your novel anywhere you want. There is flexibility in it. If halfway through, your first draft, you find that you don't like a character, you can kill them off, get rid of them, and you don't have to worry about changing your entire outline, because now this character who might have figured in scenes or chapters 16, 17, 18 out of your 20 chapter novel, you don't have to go and redo them. You just move on with your life. On a broader scale, if as a writer you are, the plot isn't going the way that you want, you have it planned out, but in the actual writing of it, it just doesn't work, you can change it on the fly. You can go where you want. So there is freedom, but this is both the pro and the con. Freedom is wonderful, but freedom can also be paralyzing to real extents. And so this is the con. It's easier to get stuck. And if you do get stuck, you don't have the safety net of the outline to help. Being a pantser is it's working without a net. You're a trapeze artist, and you're just, you have no safety. If you mess up, if you miss the trapeze bar, you're toast. There's also real danger in abandoning the project when one gets stuck instead of muddling through it, because again, you've got the outline. If you don't really know where to go, you're just sitting there and you're kind of just waiting for, like Pierce Brown said, you're waiting for lightning to strike. You're waiting for the muse to descend from Mount Parnassus to whisper in your ear and tell you where to go. And so this is where this is the part that is much less thrilling in terms of writing and moving forward. And one of the things that a lot of writers face, especially beginning writers, is they don't finish stories. And one of the things that you absolutely have to do is you gotta finish it. I don't care if it stinks. I don't care if it's like pulling teeth. You sit down and you sweat it out. And even if the result you have is terrible, it's better than not having anything at all. It's better than just going to the next story because, ooh, it's all shiny and new, and this one's giving you problems. You got to stick with it, pantsing or not. So before we go into the next section, anybody want to hazard a guess as to how I approach writing? Do you think I'm a plotter, a pantser, or a plantser? See a planter, plotter, pantser, plotter, planter, plantster. Some extra R's in there, Katie. All right, so I am in general a pantser. Um, I find that it can be very helpful to talk about, to see how other writers go about how they write. And so, did I just blow your mind, Elena? Yeah, I am for the most part, I'm a pantser. Now, to be fair, what do you win? You win my respect. Um, to be fair, when I am writing in other modes, like if I'm writing an essay or if I'm writing a very long academic piece like my dissertation, I do plot it out. But here's the thing, and I'm going back to Stephen King here. In my experience, both in terms of as a writer and as a teaching of writing, the process of creating a story and the process of writing is very much a process of discovery. King likens it to excavation. You know, you are plumbing, you're digging through your subconscious looking for gold. Sometimes you're digging with a shovel, sometimes you're digging with a trowel, sometimes you're digging with a big almighty steam shovel. Um, and so sometimes it's easier than others, but a lot of the work is done on the subconscious level. You know, as writers, we are working with the very stuff of the subconscious. And so, when I first sit down to write a story, I have a basic idea of what I want to do. I know the characters. I know the basic goal and motivation and conflict, and usually I know the climax. I know where it's leading to. Essentially, I know where it begins and I know where it ends. And my discovery process is what happens in between those moments. And so this is messy, this is sticky, but it's also for me the best way because I find that if I do plot first, if I outline it, um, the result is something that just feels artificial. It lacks a certain life and vitality that I think is very important in stories. In fact, Ross McDonald, who I quoted at the very beginning, um, you know, he talks about plot being the syntax of a story. You know, the structure. He's using a grammar term to describe this, and he's right. But there's also a valid criticism of Ross McDonald's work is that everything is at the service of the plot. He has this end goal in mind, and therefore every scene, every character action is predicated towards that. When it works, there is a beautiful unity to the story. It's like looking at a well made watch. You know, every gear, every spring, every cog, everything is working in harmony towards this single effect. When it doesn't work, some gears and cogs are being used in ways that they shouldn't. They're being used in ways that aren't natural to their actual function within, in this case, the watch or the story. And so that's the problem. Now, on the other hand, you know, Stephen King, who is a big proponent of pantsing, of letting your subconscious do the work, has a very bad problem with ending his stories. In fact, he's kind of famous for it. As much as I love him and his works, there are times I'm like, oh, you could have ended that better. In fact, if you've seen if you've seen It Chapter 2, one of the running jokes in it is that Bill Denbrough, who is a writer and who's obviously a Stephen King analog in the story, is constantly getting teased about the fact that he can't write an ending to save his soul. So, yeah, there are pros and cons to everything. And being a professional writer is all about figuring out what works for you. And so I want to show you, I'm going to walk you through a story of mine. It's called The Knight of Rhodes, Knight. And this is a story that I've been kind of sitting on for almost 2 years now. It is one that I think is actually one of my best stories, but it's also one that I haven't sold yet. So obviously other people don't share that opinion. But I started it by writing it out by hand. I have, because I'm kind of pretentious, I like using moleskin notebooks. I like the look of them. I like the feel of them. I also like using fountain pens. And so I like the romance of writing to some extent. I think, and there's a certain fun to it for me. And so I find writing it out by hand helps me a great deal. Again, I don't know where well, that's not true. I know where I'm going. I just don't know how it gets there. And so again, I know where it starts, I know where it ends, but figuring out all the middle part, the meat of it, is where a lot of the work goes into it. So I write it out by hand. It's kind of freeing for me. I enjoy the actual process. Also, I'm on the computer almost all day because of my job. So much of what I do is on the computer, grading and whatnot. So there are plenty of times where I sit down to write, and I'm like, I don't want to be at the computer. I want to be anywhere else but staring at the screen. So this helps me get around that. It also feels less permanent. It also feels like I can take chances here because it doesn't seem as final, for lack of a better term. And this might seem a little paradoxical. It also helps me because it slows me down. I can type really fast. I can handwrite fairly fast too, but not as fast as I can type. And so I'm thinking more about the words. I'm thinking more about the sound of them, the placement of them, and things like that. And so it leads, in my mind anyway, to better writing. So this is how I began. Eventually, though, if the story is good enough, in my opinion, I will transfer it over to the computer. I transferred over in a Word document, so I literally transcribe it. And so when I do that, the first draft is always has the number one after it. And so I'll write down the first draft, and then I will actually print it out, and I will read the story out loud and mark it up with a pen, because I can see things on paper that I don't see on the screen. Also, reading out loud forces me to slow down, and it helps me notice things better. And so every time I go to start doing major revisions, I save it as a new file. So the next time I do revisions, I go to the next one, and then, oh, I'm on my third set of revisions now, and so on and so forth. You can see I've done this. I have about 8 sets of revisions on here. I find this is very helpful because when I'm doing that, I'm not really throwing anything away. So if I find on revision 5 that something that didn't work in 2 now actually will work in 5, I can go back to 2 and just copy and paste it. It's kind of my safety net in a way. But it is also very time consuming. You can see that the first draft of this was in June 17, 2016. And the most recent draft is January 5th, 2018. So Been working on this a while, and that's not counting again what I wrote out by hand. That's another part. That's another thing about being a pantser, is that I'm a little bit slower. It depends on the story, of course. I have another story called Watch Children that was published last year. When I sat down to write it, it was grease lightning. It doesn't mean I didn't have several different revisions of it. It's just that it was mostly a process of adding. There wasn't a lot of taking away from it, and there wasn't a lot of major restructuring. Oh, it was heavenly. It happens very rarely, but it is wonderful. This story, Night of Rhodes, I was boxing with this. I was fighting it every night, it seemed like, because it's a character. The character, his name is Jack Knight. That's why it's called Night of Rhodes. He's a character that I came up with when I was like 13 years old or something like that. And when I was sick, when I was lonely, when I was, bored or whatever, I would make up these stories about this boy who basically is traveling America, hitchhiking, getting into trouble. Um, and so when I was an adult and felt like I was actually kind of decent at writing, and I tried to write these stories I was coming up with, I kept having trouble. And because I knew the character too well, I knew the stories too well, and therefore I lacked a certain objective point of view to really write these in a way that would be helpful to others. I'm sorry, not helpful, but be engaging and interesting and make sense to others. And so I got this idea. I was actually reading, I was thinking about Robert E. Howard and his character Conan the Barbarian. And Conan, the very first story that Howard wrote about him is actually later in his life when he's king of Aquilonia. It wasn't until after that that Howard kind of went back and started writing tales about Conan when he first left Samaria and was a pirate and a bandit and everything else. And so I was like, that's an interesting idea. Why don't I do that? And so the basic concept is that by this time in Jack's life, he has kind of become a folk hero. In the vein of the Jack stories, which are a set of stories that start in Great Britain, migrate over to Appalachia, and there's a really strong folk tradition of a character named Jack who, travels and gets into all kinds of trouble. And so the idea is that there's this folklorist who's made his bones writing about this new cycle of Jack tales. He goes to meet the actual Jack, not really thinking that he's real, and then getting involved in his own Jack tale, basically. So I wrote this out, transcribed it, printed it out, and I read it out loud. And my conclusion was, this is boring. Um, and that's because I told the story linearly. So, A moved in, everything happened in time. And so what I found is that all the really good stuff, the juicy stuff, the stuff that I think that the reader would be most interested in, happened near the end. And this is a story that runs about 35 pages, and so that won't do. If I were Stephen King or, J.K. Rowling, I might have enough clout and reader goodwill that a reader might stick with me through the boring parts to get to the good stuff, but I'm not. And so I got to hook the reader immediately. So at the advice of a friend of mine, I took scissors to the hard copy, the printout. I cut it up, rearranged the scenes, and then taped them back together. And then for like 2 weeks, every night, I would go through and I would do that digitally, what I did physically, and then read through the story and be like, okay, I need to now establish this here. and get rid of this establishing here. And now I got to make this scene transition into this scene because now the transition I had there doesn't work. And so it was a very messy process, and it took me almost a year to get it to a point where I thought that it was good enough to send out to various magazines, journals, whatnot. I, if I remember right, I submitted it to a good 10 different places, and I got rejections from all of them. Form rejections, which tells me that they probably didn't get past the first page. So obviously, I'm either not sending it to the right places, or it needs work, or you never know. I could have just caught a bunch of editors on the wrong day. That's always the problem when you submit. There's so many different variables. But going back to the point of this talk, this is the problem with pantsing. If I had plotted the entire thing out, if I had done, okay, this is scene 1, 2, 3, whatever, I might have been able to see this problem before I got into actually writing it and then having to go through and rearranging everything. I might. It's a big might, big, capital M might, because again, plotting doesn't necessarily suit my temperament. Again, writing for me is very much a process of discovery. It's kind of figuring out what I think, and sometimes I don't know what I think until I put it down on paper. So it's messy, it's time consuming, but it's also my process. It works best for me. And so you have to figure out what works best for you. So if you are a plotter and you are going to participate in NaNoWriMo, which I hope everybody who is here live and everybody who's listening to this on recording do, plot it out beforehand as best you can. Go to the level of detail and depth that you want to, that you're comfortable with, and then start doing it. If you're a pantser, you've got nothing to lose by plotting it out, trying it at least. You might find that you just completely throw it out the window day one, or you might find that you're stuck in this paradigm that doesn't really work anymore. My advice to you as a fellow pantser is bowl through it. Put your head down, work through it with the knowledge that you're going to have a lot of major revising to do later. I don't care if you're a plotter. I don't care if you're a pantser. I don't care if you're a plantser. If you start, you finish. Make that promise to yourself now. Don't promise me. Promise yourself, because you can't work with an unfinished story. You gotta finish it, because then you've got something that you can work with. Again, those of you who are plotters, you might find that NaNoWriMo is a lot easier for you. Those of you like me who are pantsers, you're sitting down every day like, wow, I wonder what today's going to hold for me. You might have a harder time of it, but that's just the thing. Regardless of how you go about writing, one of the best things that you can do for yourself is to figure out a set time to write and make a schedule. Know that from like 9 to 10 in the evening, that's writing time. So turn off your phone. People say, hey, we're going to go see a movie. You gotta bite the bullet and say, oh, I wish I could come see it, but I've got to write at that time. If you're a morning person, write in the morning before everybody else gets up. I wish I could do that, but I wake up at 7 and I hate the world and everything else. But if you can turn this into a habit, if you know that at this time of day, your butt should be in the seat writing, whether you're handwriting or writing on the computer or typewriter or dictating or however you do it, that's going to help you immensely. It's going to take time for the habit to set in. It's going to be hard work at the beginning, but eventually, this is my writing time and this is what I'm going to do. It also helps to set a certain goal in mind. For me, I try, if I am writing by hand, I want 2 handwritten pages. It's not a lot, but you would be shocked at how quickly those pages pile up. Because at the end of the week, I've got 14 pages, and that's not bad. That might be a quarter of a way through a story, or half the way through the story, depends on the length. If you were trying to get an entire novel written, you might have to go for 1,000 words a day. It's or more even. You got to figure out what you can do. But again, you have the goal. And one thing that I find is that if you set a minimum goal, like let's say instead of 1,000 words, you say, I'm going to do 500 words a day. When you reach that goal, if you're still hot, keep writing because because then you can get farther ahead. And if you're having an off day, if you have sweated every word out of that 500, know then that you stop at 500 and you've reached your goal for the day and you feel accomplished. You feel like you've actually done something. You haven't just wasted your time. One other thing that I advise is that you never end a scene. If you're getting near the end of the writing day, if you're coming up on word 500 or whatever it is that you've set, and you're in the middle and you're getting near the scene and you're writing, and he came up behind her and raised the knife and said, stop right there. Don't write another word, because then when you come back to the story tomorrow, you know exactly where you're going to pick up because you have to say what he says, what the killer says. If you end the chapter and the scene and the whatever, you're going to start the next day cold, and that can be very difficult to pick up the momentum again, even if you've plotted. So that's my basic advice. Being a good academic, I have cited the images that I use. These all come from CompFight. These are all listed as free for they're all listed under the Creative Commons license. Also, we're cited some of the things that I pulled from. So I've done enough talking. Do y'all have any questions or comments for us? The archives for the previous Nano go-tos. Boy, you had to ask me a question I don't have the answer to. I do believe they're being put up through the library. So if you go on Full Sail One and check on the library page, that might you might find it there. I'm sorry, I don't know that off the top of my head. This has been a crazy month. Also, would anybody like me to unmute you so you can talk and not have to type? You will be on. You will be recorded, so I understand if you don't want to. So, any other questions or comments? Oh, Scott, let me unmute you, buddy. Okay, I've unmuted you, but I think you might have muted yourself too. So you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Sure can.
Okay. And like I said, I was talking about earlier, is sometimes difficult. You have too many ideas, but you don't know what to go for. How do you figure that out? Because like I said, I've been a pantser, I've been a plotter, and now I'm in between. So how do you figure that out best? Like which story to try to go for and try to develop? Or do you try to develop all of them and see where it goes to?
Well, I'm going to give you advice that my mom would give you, which is pick one and run with it. That's basically what I do. I have many, many different stories rolling around in my head. Sometimes sometimes they just speak to me. Sometimes like I'm doing dishes and I'm like, oh yeah, I totally want to write this. Other times it's like things are just kind of rattling around in my head and I just choose one at random. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but I say just choose one. And it doesn't matter what you choose, but whichever one you do choose, make sure you finish it.
Thank you.
So, Elena, you have 12 works in progress? Whew, that is a lot. Um, that I would say focus on one and finish it. And that's an issue I think a lot of writers have, which is you know having the idea is a lot of fun. Um, Sometimes bringing that idea to life isn't as much fun. There are some writers, and I actually hate when writers say this, but there's some out there who say, I love having written, but I hate writing. And my attitude is, why do you do it if you don't love it? I'm not one who subscribes to the idea that if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. I love teaching. I adore teaching and I adore writing. And there are plenty of days where teaching and writing are work. Just That's just because maybe that's a temperament issue, but you got to sit down and do it. That one fella, that one pantser who was talking about waiting for lightning to strike and stuff like that. Um, Obviously, he's been published and is well known enough to be asked to do a quote for Goodreads. Um, but I feel like he is exaggerating some aspects and not talking about the reality of it, which is if you're a plotter or a pantser, you got to sit down and do it. In the end, it's all about sitting down and writing. Sit down and write. Sit down and write. It's a job. You don't wait for lightning to strike. You don't wait for the muses to descend from Mount Parnassus. You figure it out and you sweat it through. Because again, there are plenty of days where I've run into like, I'm really not sure where this is going, or I have no clear idea what I'm going to do today. And what I do is I just sit down and write. I put one word and then I put a word after that and a word after that and a word after that. It may be garbage. It may be, I may have to delete it tomorrow or somewhere down the line, but it's on the paper and I can work with what's on the paper. I can't work with what's in my head. And so, and sometimes it's not awesome. Sometimes it is garbage. And I'm not saying this like a thing out of false modesty or something like that. Sometimes there's things that are just that have written are just garbage. I had, I showed you, my notebook. Each tab, if you, I don't know if you see these pink tabs, those are where a story starts. And so I have one, two, three, four, five, about 7 stories in this notebook. I haven't looked through that notebook in a while, but I can guarantee you that at least 2 of them are pretty terrible. And that's okay because I don't know that they're terrible until I actually write it. And eventually I will figure out how to make them not terrible. But I got to put it down there. I got to write it. Again, you will make it better. Sometimes it takes 8 or 12 or God knows how many revisions, but eventually you're going to get it. So these are really good questions. Do you have any more? Yeah, absolutely. Revise. Um, that's where it actually gets good. Um, it is so rare just sit down and have a story just come out perfect. Even the one that I talked about, Watch Children, that came out, that was just like the words just flowed like honey. That still required revision. It still required me, going down, sitting, printing it out, reading it out loud, figuring out, oh, okay, this doesn't work, or I need to emphasize this, I need to delete that, I need to make this clearer, and whatnot. And then sometimes you just got to know when to put the story away. That story, I ran into an issue because one of my trusted readers, one of the people that I go to first, um, is Mr. Mark Thomas, who teaches children's entertainment at Full Sail. And so I had him read Watch Children, and he liked it, but he also didn't really get it. And so I revised it a few times, and he still is like, he got it, but he didn't get it. Like intellectually, he understood the point of the story, but he didn't really get it emotionally. I had other people, other readers that I trust who read it, and and they got it. They didn't just understand it intellectually; they understood it emotionally. It hit them where they lived, so to speak. And so eventually, I was like, you know what? I think it's good enough. Um, I think it's good enough to get out there, and some people it's going to work for, and other people it won't. And it got published. And I got $25 whole for it. It's actually the most I've ever made off of my writing. But it takes revision. It takes revising. It takes sitting down and picking it apart. So, any other questions? This is great stuff. Good. I'm glad. And again, for those, I'm not saying plot isn't important. I know King is really down on plot. But plot is the vehicle for the story. It is the syntax of the story, and so you need it. Um, but you but you can't forget that there's a story there as well. It's a difference between what happens and why it happens. So you keep that in mind, and you'll do very well. And whether a plotter or a pantser, be flexible, because even plotters, they're working from the subconscious. And the subconscious goes in weird places, and sometimes stories, um, they I know this is cliche, but they take a life of their own. Characters act in different ways. um, Plots go, like, they act and they do and they go places that you never thought of. And um, for me, that's usually when I know that I'm on to something, when it's like my subconscious is taking the wheel, and now I'm just kind of sitting there, watching it go. Yeah, trust your instincts, Elena. It's not always going to lead you right, but you'll be tapping into something. And again, whatever you do on the page can be undone. It can be changed. It can be made better. That again, that's why I've been harping on y'all about finishing your story, because if you finish, you got something that you can work with, and it may be bad. Again, there are very few first drafts that are just amazing. And even the amazing ones still take time. Time and revision, time and work. Okay, so we're starting to wind down now. I'm totally cool with staying for a little while longer, but I want to do one more round of questions or comments, and then I'm going to stop the recording. And if anybody still wants to talk a little bit, I'm totally cool with that, but I don't want this to go on too long. I want this to be kind of a nice 55 to 60 minute recording. Well, you're quite welcome. Thank you for coming. So it looks like I'm getting mostly thank you, so I am going to go ahead and stop the recording now. If you are listening to this and you would like to discuss this more, my email is jbegley@fullsail.com. It's jbegley@fullsail.com, and I'm more than happy to talk with you. So, for those of you who are here live and those of you who are listening to the recording, um, I wish you luck. NaNoWriMo is hard, and if you can do it, that is such an accomplishment. Just writing a novel in that time, even if it's just a quarter of a novel, is an amazing experience. And, I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but finish it. You start it, you finish it. Okay? So this is your old Dr. J signing off.